this episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you enjoy this or any other episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend. There aren't many battles that have the title of miracle, but today's does. At the outset of World War II, hundreds of thousands of British and French troops were cornered, each of them realizing they faced death, not theoretically, but mathematically. The might of the Blitzkrieg, the might of the Panzer tank from Germany, and the will and precision of the German Luftwaffe had been seen by all of the boys of the British Expeditionary Force on the fields of France and Belgium. What was seen by all to be an inevitable massacre was answered by a single solitary British naval officer who cabled back to British HQ, quote, "But if not," end quote. A phrase from the book of Daniel in the Bible, a phrase recognizable to nearly every Brit at the time. It meant the situation was desperate. Daniel 3:17 through 18. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, let it be known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. End quote. They knew their God was not obligated to rescue them, that it would take a miracle to save them. But if not, they would fight with honor to the end. A rescue mission was planned and enacted. Of the roughly 350,000 boys on the beaches of Dunkirk facing down the Nazi onslaught, the rescue mission intended to save roughly 45,000. A triumph, mathematically, with the odds faced against them. Britain sent out a call beyond the order to their navy, and that call was answered by the fathers and the grandfathers, the brothers and the mothers of the boys stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk, fishermen, recreational seacraft, dinghies, sailboats, a war fleet comprised of the common man, comprised of the fathers of the boys on the beaches, answered. In the end, a little over 338,000 boys were saved, despite the British High Command praying for 45,000. My dad was a merchant mariner, a sea captain. I grew up on the waters with him. While the mainstream narrative is that Churchill's words inspired a nation, which they did, and that Hitler hesitated, which he too did, I believe that this rescue operation, which ended up turning the tide of the war, was so overwhelmingly successful because my dad, whether by sailboat or rowboat, would never have left me alone on that beach to die, just as I wouldn't leave my own sons. And that, in the strength of the fathers in the family, that is how wars are won. Let's now experience this miracle at the Battle of Dunkirk.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 49, The Battle of Dunkirk, from the 24th of May to the 4th of June, 1940. British forces, 9 British and 5 French divisions, totaling approximately 400,000 men. German forces, 9 division in the assault, totaling roughly 200,000 men. The momentary hesitation of the German High Command became a turning point in the war, granting the British forces a narrow window to escape from France. This delay preserved the core of Britain's army, ensuring they could stand as the island's shield in its darkest hour and fight another day on the battlefields of Europe.
On the 1st of September 1939, with a thunderous roar of war, the Nazi invasion of Poland began. And from that day onward, the German armies knew nothing but triumph. Every plan, every assault, executed with precision, saw their enemies crumble beneath their boots. Within mere weeks, Poland was erased from the map, a swift conquest that sent shockwaves across Europe. The Germans paused only for the winter before unleashing a fresh storm. In April and May of 1940, they crushed Denmark and stormed into Norway with a cold, unstoppable momentum. On the 10th of May, the German war machine turned its sights westward, tearing into Holland and Belgium, with a ferocity designed to clear the path for the greater prize, France. Just as in 1870 and again in 1914, the Germans once more prepared to strike at the heart of France. Their meticulously crafted plans aimed at breaking the nation's will with brutal speed. The French, clinging to the lessons of the last war, believed they had forged an impregnable defense, their mighty Maginot Line, a string of fortresses that in their minds would halt any German advance cold. This labyrinth of concrete and steel spanned from the Swiss border guarding France's eastern frontier up to Belgium, a colossal barrier that stood as a symbol of French resolve, though its Achilles heel lay hidden. But the fatal flaw in France's grand defense was all too clear. The line stopped at Belgium. In a misplaced faith, the Belgian government, scarred by the last war, refused to invest in extending the fortifications, certain that Germany would never dare violate their neutrality again. France's hands were tied, unable to stretch the Maginot Line to the sea without alienating Belgium, and so the very gap that had doomed them in 1914, the Ardennes, lay open once more, inviting the Germans to repeat their deadly maneuver in 1940. As they had done in 1870, the Germans set their sights on Sedan, the fortress city whose fall would signal the unraveling of France's defenses. By striking at Sedan, the Germans sought to pin the French armies in place, allowing their armored divisions to surge toward the coast, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force trapped along the Belgian frontier. The British and French, shackled by the outdated tactics of 1918, were woefully unprepared for the brutal speed and relentless force of the German blitzkrieg. Their readiness for trench warfare was no match for the lightning-fast armor and air power that now tore through their lines. The German strategy unfolded flawlessly. Their armored columns, with infantry securing their flanks, smashed through the Allied defenses, driving the once confident French and British forces into a chaotic retreat. Yet amidst the onslaught, the British and Belgians, though battered, held their nerve long enough to withdraw with a semblance of order, managing, if only briefly, to keep a united front against this German tide. The Allies' downfall, however, lay in their fractured command. French, British, and Belgian units fought as though they were separate armies, their inability to coordinate rendering any real defense all but impossible. The chaos deepened within the French ranks, where a constantly shifting command structure undermined any hope of cohesive leadership, even though they were meant to lead the Allied forces. At the helm of the French forces stood General Maurice Gamelin, though not for long. In a week, he was cast aside, replaced by the aging General Maxime Weygand, a move that further clouded France's already disjointed command. Below them, subordinates shifted as frequently as the orders, and the chain of command, stretching tenuously to the British, was tangled in bureaucracy and in indecision. To compound the disaster, these generals, relics of an older era, communicated not by the speed of radio, but by the absurd slowness of motorcycle couriers or personal meetings, as though time were not the enemy. Such archaic methods were doomed from the start, no match for the terrifying rapidity of the German onslaught that simply swept across the battlefield. Adding yet another layer of complexity, General Lord Gort, commander of the British forces, was empowered to bypass French leadership and appeal directly to London should his men be in peril, an option he would soon exercise. Leading the German armored fist was Heinz Guderian, whose panzers, moving with breathtaking speed, left the Allies reeling and disoriented, struggling to keep pace with this new kind of warfare. Even more shocking to the Allies was the revelation that the Germans had no interest in Paris. Their true objective was far more devastating: the English Channel, a direct move to choke the lifeline between Britain and France. As the realization set in, the Allied command scrambled to exploit a small window of hope. German armor had raced ahead, leaving its infantry far behind. The only viable counterstrike was for British and French forces to converge, shattering the Panzer spearhead and cutting them off from their support. But the fatal flaw lay not in the plan, but in the execution. Gamelin's headquarters, hopelessly outdated and without a functioning radio, left the Allied forces blind to each other's movements. The chance to halt the German advance died in that silence. As a result, by the 20th of May, Guderian's tanks rolled into the Channel coast, meeting only token resistance, the Allied armies in disarray, unable to mount any sort of coordinated defense. With their backs against the wall, the British Expeditionary Force, though woefully lacking an army, made a desperate stand. On the 21st of May, they hurled their few remaining tanks at the German flank at Arras, a last-ditch effort to stall what was inevitable. 74 fresh tanks from England smashed into the German rear, sowing chaos among Guderian's once relentless columns. For 2 tense days, the Germans found themselves on the defensive, caught off guard by the sudden ferocity of this British counterattack. But the Germans were quick to retaliate. Their fearsome air power, combined with the devastating precision of their 88mm anti-aircraft guns, now deployed as anti-tank weapons, crushed this British assault. And by the 23rd of May, the British were forced to withdraw, leaving behind a smoking battlefield and only 2 of their tanks intact. While the British retreated, the German panzers surged relentlessly up the coast. On the 21st of May, they encircled Boulogne, and by the next day, Calais had fallen into their iron grip, further tightening the noose around the Allies. By this stage, German tanks stood at Gravelines, a mere 10 miles from Dunkirk, the last remaining portal of escape for the beleaguered British forces. The trap was nearly complete. If Guderian's advance had persisted, his armored columns would have driven the British straight into the crushing jaws of General von Bock's forces sweeping in from Belgium, leaving the expeditionary force doomed to annihilation. But fate, in the form of Adolf Hitler's interference, spared the British that final blow. His decision would change the course of history. Hitler, brimming with confidence, visited the headquarters of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt at Charleville near Sedan. It was here, with victory almost certainly assured, that the Führer's infamous hesitation would shape the battle's outcome. Von Rundstedt, cautious in his approach, had already defied Berlin's orders to continue the armored assault, sensing that the moment required a pause. The British thrust at Arras, and the gathering of French forces to the south weighed heavily on his mind. Rundstedt halted his armored divisions, giving them time to regroup while waiting for the lagging infantry to close the gap. Hitler, defying the advice of his more aggressive generals, confirmed Rundstedt's halt. His reasons remain a topic of debate, shrouded in speculation and uncertainty. Some suggest that his advisors had cautioned against sending tanks into the notoriously muddy terrain of Flanders, a battlefield Hitler knew all too well from his days as a soldier in the First World War. Others believe Hitler hesitated out of sheer wariness. The invasion had unfolded far too smoothly, and he feared some unforeseen disaster might yet await his overextended forces. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, further emboldened Hitler's pause, promising that his air force could obliterate the isolated British and Belgian remnants in the Low Countries without need for further take advances. Some have argued that Hitler's restraint was politically motivated, believing that utterly humiliating the British would only harden their resolve and make peace negotiations more difficult. Whatever the true reasoning, the effect was clear. Hitler's hesitation granted the British a precious 3-day reprieve. In those days, the British dug in, fortifying Dunkirk and preparing for the fight of their lives. Yet it was not Dunkirk's defense that would make history. It was the escape. The audacity of what followed would become legend. As early as the 19th of May, General Lord Gort, seeing the writing on the wall, began laying the groundwork for an evacuation through Dunkirk. He knew the battlefield had already been lost, and survival now depended on escape. Every move Gort made from that moment forward was aimed at one singular goal: saving his men. Regardless of any orders from the French command under Weygand, his focus was singular: Dunkirk. Though Guderian's tanks had momentarily paused, the Belgians continued to bear the brunt of the German onslaught from the east, their defenses buckling under the relentless German pressure. Gort, calculating every move, dispatched reinforcements to bolster the beleaguered Belgian lines. Together with the tank assault at Arras, this bought him just enough time to pull his forces into a defensive pocket around Dunkirk. But in the end, this was a brief reprieve. On the 28th of May, King Leopold, faced with the annihilation of his forces, surrendered Belgium, leaving the Allies scrambling to hold the line. The British government, unwilling to concede the field just yet, urged Gort to keep fighting. But with the French retreat already having exposed his right flank, and British forces quietly slipping away through Dunkirk, Gort knew there was no honor left in this fight, only survival. Gort's foresight paid off. He convinced London to approve an evacuation, setting in motion the daring plan known as Operation Dynamo, a desperate bid to pull tens of thousands of soldiers from the certainty of death. The call went out across Britain. Every seaworthy vessel along the southern coast was to be readied. From warships to fishing boats, a ragtag fleet would sail to Dunkirk to bring their soldiers, to bring their boys home. On the 26th of May, the first phase of the evacuation began. Non-combat personnel, cooks, clerks, medics were ferried away from the coming storm, the harbinger of the larger operation yet to unfold. The British kept this evacuation under wraps, even from their French allies. The French, along with the Belgians and British, were falling back to Dunkirk to prepare for a last stand, unaware that the British had already begun plotting their escape. Dunkirk itself lay in ruins. Relentless bombing had reduced the port to a shadow of its former self, its power grid shattered, its cranes idle and useless. The city teetered on the brink of collapse. The harbor that was once bustling with life was now a graveyard of sunken ships. Incendiary bombs had scorched the city, leaving it a smoking, charred shell. Yet despite the devastation, the harbor remained the lifeblood of the evacuation. The majority of men who escaped did so from its battered shores, while fewer than a third were pulled from the exposed beaches. Overseeing this massive effort was Admiral Sir B.H. Ramsay. Since the 20th of May, he had been marshalling every craft at his disposal, preparing for the unprecedented evacuation. On the 26th of May, Ramsay received his orders. Evacuate 45,000 men in just 2 days, a task that seemed impossible in the chaos of this war. The British government at the outset dared not hope for more. They believed 45,000 men to be the maximum that could be rescued from the tightening German grip. Over 800 vessels answered the call. From destroyers to fishing boats, these ships played their part, with smaller craft ferrying soldiers to the larger ships waiting in deeper waters, a patchwork navy tasked with saving an army. Above them, Hermann Göring sought to fulfill his boast to Hitler, unleashing the full might of the Luftwaffe on the retreating forces. But the Royal Air Force rose to meet them, engaging in daily battles for control over the skies of Dunkirk. Dunkirk's location proved a challenge for both sides. German aircraft flying from Western Germany and British fighters crossing the Channel were each stretched to their limits, with little fuel left for the bitter air battles that raged overhead. With clouded skies obscuring much of the fighting, the soldiers on the ground saw little of the aerial duels above, and their spirits sagged, both on the beaches of Dunkirk and back home in Britain. What etched itself into the memories of the men at Dunkirk were not the hidden air battles, but the terrifying German bombers and strafing fighters whose relentless assaults seemed unending. Amidst growing frustration, the Royal Air Force sought clarity from the government, and it was Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself who assured the British public that their pilots were holding their own in the fight for Dunkirk. Nonetheless, the bulk of the evacuation had to be conducted under the cover of darkness, as the threat of daytime air raids loomed large over the beaches. The soldiers stranded on the open beaches, though vulnerable, found an unlikely ally in the sand itself, which absorbed much of the impact from the bombs that fell ceaselessly around them. When the German panzers finally resumed their advance after a 3-day pause, they met a wall of British steel and British determination. The men who were hardened by their desperation had used the precious respite to dig in and fortify their defenses. The Germans had the numbers, their tanks outmatching the British and French anti-tank defenses. Yet, what should have been a swift and an easy victory now became a hard-fought battle clawed from the jaws of hesitation. As German divisions peeled off to encircle the French First Army at Lille, those that remained hammered the British defenses around Dunkirk, battering the perimeter even as thousands of men slipped away by sea. The early days of Operation Dynamo faltered, rescuing only 28,000 men instead of the hoped-for 45,000. But by the 30th of May, the full might of the evacuation was underway, with boats coming and going in a relentless rhythm. By the end of May, 125,000 soldiers had been plucked from the encircling Germans by both naval boats and private craft, who answered the call for rescue from the shores of their distant fishing villages across the channel. The harbor at Dunkirk, now reduced to a shattered ruin, could no longer handle the evacuation, forcing the remaining men to huddle on the beaches, staring out at the sea, waiting for their salvation. Despite the chaos and the looming threat of annihilation, discipline held firm. Thousands of soldiers, eyes trained on the horizon, stood in eerily quiet lines, awaiting their turn to board the boats, each man knowing that order was their only hope. In the beginning, the boats were instructed to ferry only British troops, leaving the French to hold the lane. This division of roles caused little friction at first, as the French believed they were holding out for reinforcements, not abandonment. But as the German noose tightened and hope faded, the French troops, watching their British comrades sail to safety, began clamoring for evacuation as well, no longer willing to sacrifice themselves in a doomed defense. Recognizing the growing desperation, Churchill issued an order on the 30th of May. Every soldier, British or French, was to be evacuated without discrimination. No man would be left behind purely because of his uniform. Yet, as with all things in war, Churchill's command was slow to reach the men on the ground. Tensions flared on the beach as French and British soldiers, uncertain of their fate, faced difficult moments of mistrust and of fear. In the nights of the 2nd and 3rd of June, the final desperate evacuations focused on the French soldiers who had held the line. But by dawn on the 4th of June, Operation Dynamo was over. The boats stopped coming, and Dunkirk's beaches fell silent. When the last ship departed Dunkirk, 338,226 soldiers had been rescued from the jaws of certain death. Among them, 123,095 Frenchmen who had fought valiantly to the bitter end. In the final frantic 48 hours, 60,000 French soldiers escaped. But as the clock struck 3 a.m. on the 4th of June, the evacuation ended. Roughly 40,000 French troops remained, left to face the inevitable as German forces closed in. The remnants of the French army fought on, but by the 17th of June, the battle was lost. A ceasefire was declared, and by the 22nd of June, France had formally surrendered. The dream of resistance was over, and Hitler's Reich ruled supreme over the continent. By this moment in history, Adolf Hitler had ascended to the unchallenged ruler of Europe. His armies stretched from the Atlantic to the heart of Poland, his conquests seeming unstoppable. Swollen with triumph, Hitler barely gave the British Expeditionary Force a second thought. In his mind, their escape was a minor detail, a nuisance in the grand tapestry of his continental dominance. Hitler believed that even if the British refused to ally with him, they would, in time, begrudgingly accept his mastery over mainland Europe, seeing no alternative but peace. Hitler expressed his desire for a peace with Britain that, in his words, quote, would allow her to preserve her national honor, end quote. A thinly veiled offer that masked what many believed were his true ambitions. Churchill's response was nothing short of legendary. With words that stirred the very soul of Britain, he roared, quote, "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender," end quote. Dunkirk was the foundation of that unbreakable vow. Without the escape of the British Expeditionary Force, Britain would have faced the specter of war with barely an army to stand behind Churchill's defiant words. Though they left behind mountains of irreplaceable equipment, what Britain gained was far more valuable: battle-hardened veterans. Soldiers who had stared death in the face and lived to fight again. This core of experienced fighters would become the backbone of a new British army. Without them, Britain's defense would have rested on untrained recruits, lacking both the weapons and the wisdom of battle. Without the Dunkirk veterans, Hitler's planned invasion of Britain might have been met with little more than the civilian home guard: farmers, shopkeepers, and old men armed with shotguns defending the beaches. But now these soldiers would stand as Britain's shield and her sword, ready to repel any German invasion, and when the time came, to carry the fight across the Mediterranean into North Africa, and eventually back to the shores of France. The fierce resistance at Dunkirk sent ripples of unease through the German military. Their seemingly invincible march had, for the first time, met with a foe that could hold its ground, even in retreat. The Luftwaffe, once unchallenged in the skies of Europe, finally faced a worthy adversary. In the 9 days of the Dunkirk evacuation, they lost 240 aircraft, and by July, nearly 30% of their fleet had been grounded. A sobering reminder that their air superiority was not absolute. The Royal Air Force, with its sleek Hurricanes and Spitfires, had proven their mettle. The feared Messerschmitts, which had so easily dominated other skies, now faced equal opponents, and the RAF stood ready for the battles yet to come. The British government's strategic choice not to waste its precious Royal Air Force resources in France, once defeat was certain, ensured that when the time came for the fateful Battle of Britain, there would be a solid core of planes and pilots ready to meet the Luftwaffe and challenge Hitler's ambition with the boys of Britain.